as I'm speaking, if you think there's an opportune time for you to ask a follow-up question about what I'm talking about, allow this to be a little bit conversational in that sense. If it's something you'd like to wait and ask when I'm finished, around, let's say, 45 minutes from now, you can do that as well. And then we can have kind of a question-answer period, so you can be thinking about things you'd like to ask. So one time I was sitting on an airplane, and I was looking at my scores, as I do oftentimes. It's a place where you can actually really concentrate. You don't hear too much interference. And someone asked me if I was a composer, and I said, no, but I'm a conductor. And he said, so does someone get them all ready for you, and then you just come in and wave your hands at the concert? And that's when I thought, I don't even know where to begin. I don't know where to begin talking about this, if that's the idea. And the thing is, you can't really fault anyone for thinking something like that if they go to an orchestra concert, because all they see is the conductor walk out, stand in front of the orchestra, move his or her hands, and the orchestra plays, and they walk off. So if you're not really following the culture of orchestral music, you wouldn't necessarily know anything different. You think that they're just playing anything. Well, what difference does that make anyway? Is it just to keep them together, or what's really the purpose? So let's start somewhere, I don't want to say toward the beginning, but start back a little bit and then talk about what my role is over time. So if we go way back to the beginning of conducting, we might say that it probably happened with choirs, church choirs. And we're talking about the early centuries AD. We're talking very early when groups of people were around and they wanted to sing together. They needed some mechanism for being able to stay together. And so there was someone who would basically wave. There's even evidence of in Egypt and in Greece of people, when they're singing, the conductor would add shapes and kind of a tempo so that people could stay together. And then over time, when instruments came into the church and then started to be performing in a secular situation, let's jump up to all the way to French Baroque music and even Italian Baroque music like Vivaldi. We can look back to Jean-Baptiste Lully, who famously or infamously was using a staff and tapping the floor. This is back in the 17th century, and accidentally hit his foot, stabbed his foot, got angry, and died because of that. Now, you never think that conducting is something where that you could cause a fatality to yourself. But that is exactly what happened to Lully, who was a very famous composer from the French Baroque period and was conducting, but it was simply to keep people together, and that tapping on the floor was doing that. So those were some of the early forms of conducting. It was just simply for time. That was it. Keep people together, that's your only purpose. When we see the small ensembles of Vivaldi, for example, where there's harpsichord and a lead violinist, usually the concertmaster, either one of those people would usually be the leader. Harpsichordist could start something here and start playing, and they'd play something very rhythmic, and then they're sitting so that everyone could see them, and they could give some kind of motion with their hand. First violinist could do a preparation with the bow, and sometimes, if they're not playing at that moment, they could even move the bow. Not in necessarily any particular conducting pattern, but simply in a way that shows the pulse of the music. Now, when music got increasingly complex and orchestras got larger and larger, it became very difficult for the concertmaster to do that anymore. But this is an example of Vivaldi's music, The Four Seasons. This is the spring, which you all know very well. And I just want to show you what the score looks like, because this is really primarily what I want to talk about today. You see the string family here. There are four families of instruments in the orchestra. There's the string family, the percussion family, the woodwinds, and the brass. That's it. Harp, they go in their own category somewhere else. But This is really the strings here. And you see there's a solo part above here. And then the first violins, who are to my immediate left, if you're watching the stage. Second violins, violas, and then basso continuo. In this case, it would be the basses, double basses, and the cellos, and the harpsichord that would be playing an unrealized version of what the chords are here. And Paul can give you a lecture on it later about how that all works. But this is all you see here. You see really these 4 staves plus the solo line up above. And at the beginning, everyone's playing the same part in terms of the violins and the solo part. So there's not really, the soloist is not standing out at this particular moment. It's called a tutti, or everybody playing together. And then a little bit farther on into the piece, you would see where the violinist plays his or her own part. And that happens a little bit later. You can see some of the indications that are in the music here. These are not my markings, but they are the markings of a good friend of mine, Rachel Barton-Pine, who's an outstanding violinist. And she marked the parts and marked the score in such a way that shows the bowings. So some of you are string players, I'm sure, and you recognize what these mean. Up bow, and that this raises to here, this is a lift, and then we have a down bow, it looks like this, and these are up bows. Now, in this particular case, the soloist would probably like to do these because so much of what they play, the soloist, matches what the first violins have to play. Now, when it gets into larger pieces where there isn't a violin soloist, usually the concertmaster makes those decisions. Which way, if you're ever wondering, how do they all decide they're going to be up bow and down bow at the same time? The concertmaster makes that decision for the first violins. They mark their part. They hand it to the principal second violinist. That person consults the first violin part, and then similar passages are bowed in a similar way. And so on. It goes to the violas and the cellos and the double basses. All this goes back to the librarian, who then spends so many hours, right, Sue? Writing, copying all these bowings into all the parts with a pencil. That takes a very long time. It's a lot of meticulous work to make sure that happens, because the players want to be doing the same kind of bowing. Otherwise, you see this kind of thing going on. And there was a time when Leopold Stokowski, who was at the Philadelphia Orchestra, he didn't want bowings to be together. He said, I want everyone to do free bowings. You do it however you want. It's more important that we have this connected sound. But that didn't really catch on with most orchestras, because you have a more unified sound if you all are lifting the bow at the same time, if you're in the same part of the bow when you're bowing a string instrument. So those are some of the markings we have here. And this is Rachel Barton-Pine, the soloist. These are her markings to do, for example, the diminuendo on this note. So if we're thinking about Baroque style, one of those elements is that you don't sustain the sound really long like you would in Brahms or Wagner or Berlioz, where you really want the sound to be very, very sustained and go through the whole line. In this case, you actually want the sound to go away so that you can hear the counterpoint of other instruments coming in. And to that end, I remember working with Rachel on this particular piece, and she wanted everyone to use Baroque bows. Baroque bows are weighed differently so that they don't have that ability to sustain really strong, which actually helps Baroque music because it makes it speak. You can play in a very vigorous way and you won't cover other instruments with the sound. Whereas if you play with a romantic bow, which is almost what everybody plays with, it's more difficult because those notes will naturally sustain more. So I'm getting in a little bit of particular stylistic issues about Baroque music, but this is just a chance to see how large that stave is. So going back to conducting and the history, as we get into the 19th century, we see composers mostly conducting their own works. So there wasn't really like a separate conducting profession. You didn't, if you were in the 19th century, you probably didn't say, I want to grow up to be a conductor. You'd likely study composition, if that's something you were interested in with orchestras, and then you would probably conduct your own work. You probably wouldn't conduct a work of someone else. But sometimes composers needed other composers to conduct their works because they didn't feel like they had the ability physically to really do it very well, because that is one of the things you have to be able to do, is to be able to communicate non-verbally and be very, very clear to an ensemble. So then people like Mendelssohn, we're talking about the mid-19th century now, Berlioz and Wagner, started to conduct the music of other people. And that's really where things started to be born in terms of conducting. And you have people like Berlioz, again, and Richard Wagner, writing whole treatises on conducting. Wagner talks about how do I decide what the right tempo is for a piece, you know. Even though they had metronome markings back then, not everyone used metronome markings. A metronome marking can be very precise. You're using a machine to actually measure how fast a piece should go. And what's interesting about that is that some composers said, I don't want that. I don't want that to be in a straitjacket, my music. I want the interpreter, conductor, or whoever to be the person who decides that. And what I find fascinating about that, just for a little tangent here, is that someone like Gustav Mahler, who was much more famous as a conductor during his day than he was as a composer. Now he's known, obviously, as a composer. But during his day, he conducted so much opera and so much music of other composers. And yet when he wrote his own symphonies, he would not write in a metronome marking. He wrote tempo markings, but they were always verbal. And what I find interesting about that is that Mahler is probably the most verbose composer I have ever seen. I've conducted a lot of works, but when I say verbose, I mean he will write entire paragraphs with a little footnote, like a little star up there in the score, and then you read the bottom footnote. And it is a very long-winded way to say that the basses, if they have the capability on their instrument, should go to a low C, but should not be too loud, and maybe only the second and fourth players in the section should do that. Extremely detailed. So by reading something like that, you think, this guy wouldn't want anything to be amiss at all, because it has to be so, just so. And yet, what does he say for a tempo marking? Basic debate. Somewhat agitated. That's it. How fast is somewhat agitated? It depends on how you feel that day. Depends on what he was thinking. Depends on what you see from music. Is it the half note that is that way? Is it the quarter note? You have no indication. And so for someone who is this precise about every little thing, the tempo is wide open. And we know that a tempo, that if it's wildly different from what you're used to, can almost ruin the experience for you, or can make it incredibly exciting. So tempo is such an important thing, and that is something that the conductor is responsible for with the full symphony orchestra. So now we're up to about Mahler's time. This is the late 19th century, and we're seeing that there is really starting to be this rise of the conducting profession. We have people like, that you probably maybe haven't heard of unless you do a lot of reading, but Hans Richter, Arthur Nikisch, Hans von Bülow. These were all conductors who would conduct other people's music. Sure, yeah, and Beethoven as well. We could go ahead and bring that up, and if we can get that so that we can see the whole score. Yeah, so I have about, I don't know how many hundreds of scores I have at home. I could pick something at random and show you how I mark it. But since we're doing Beethoven's 7th Symphony, next year, more about that later, I thought I would show you something here. And you can't even, we're almost to the bottom of the page here, but this is, oh, there we go. Okay. So you can, this is a little bit blurry here, but I think you can see what it is. Some of the things that I have to look at. This is one stave of music. So if you're used to looking at a piano score or something like that, you usually see two staves. One primarily played with your right hand, and one with the left hand, treble clef and bass clef. In this particular case, all this is one bar of the piece. This is the second bar of the piece, and third bar. So all of these things are happening vertically, and some of you who have looked at orchestral scores, this isn't too bewildering to you. But some of the things I have to look at are the harmony of what's happening in every single bar, so that I know vertically how everything is stacked, so I know what to expect. So it takes really going through very carefully and looking at every note, looking at the voicing, obviously the key signature, and looking at the poco sostenuto marking. Now in this particular case, Beethoven did write in metronome markings. He lived long before Mahler, so we know that Mahler had access to the metronome markings. Beethoven was fascinated by the metronome. In fact, he had published a lot of his works without the metronome. It was invented during his lifetime. He wanted to go back to his already published works and write in the metronome markings afterwards, because he was so fascinated with how the metronome worked. So I have kind of a code of how I mark my scores. The red here is which instrument it is that's playing. So I have oboe 1, clarinet 1 and 2, horn 1 and 2. That's my shorthand for writing a horn right there, that little kind of zero. Flute up here, FL. I use blue marker, pencil that is, to circle the dynamics, the dynamic contrast, and the things that especially have to be paid attention to. Certain things like the forte means loud. They come in on the different, chords here, but I already know that. So there are things that when you study the score, sometimes you just need reminders, or it also makes it easier when you go back to study something for a second time. You have your notations there so you can kind of start a little bit higher up. You're not starting from scratch. Now, having said that, sometimes I have scores that are so heavily marked that I just put them to the side and I order a new score, and I start with absolutely fresh so I can rethink some of these things and have new things stand out. But this has mostly helped with studying the score, not so much with conducting the score, because this is where you spend your kind of lonely hours in preparation. You know, going back to the person who was asking me if I just walk in to conduct, move my hands around and someone else prepares the orchestra. The amount that anyone sees is that little tiny vertical slice of time that the conductor stands in front of the orchestra. And so if you were to make a pie chart of how much time a conductor spends preparing for a concert and how much you see, you would see that the vast majority, more than 3/4, would be all just spent alone with the score. Maybe at the piano, maybe at the lap, maybe at the kitchen table, wherever it is, in a park. That's kind of the nice thing about conducting. If you're studying, you can do it anywhere, just about. And then there's another little slice of that pie that would be conducting the orchestra in the rehearsals. That would be about 10 hours worth, because you have 4 rehearsals, each are 2.5 hours long. Then you have the concert, and that's that little sliver of pie. And that's all you see. That's all you see, or anyone who's not in music, that's all they would see. So that's how they make their judgment. This is what a conductor does. But all the work happens before. And mostly what the conductor is doing at the concert is giving reminders. Reminders, this is what we did in rehearsal. This is the tempo we took in rehearsal. This is where we do a subito piano. This is where we crescendo. And if they're very well prepared, and the conductor is well prepared, you can be very spontaneous in the concert. So you prepare it a certain way in the rehearsals, and then if you kind of send out some radar here from your mind, and you can sense it among the other players. There is a way to do this. I can't explain it, but you can feel it. They're ready for something. They're ready to go faster at this spot that we've never done before. They're ready to do a transition in a different way than we've ever done before. They will play something even more quietly than they've ever played it before. You just have to sense that, and that's the magic of the performance. Something you cannot replicate in the rehearsal, no matter how hard you try. Why? Because the performance is game day. There's no other preparation for game day. You can't say, I'm gonna pretend it's game day in this rehearsal, and then you'll be able to play just like you do in a concert. That's not really possible. All the simulation you can do won't match the white-hot moment of performing for other people and knowing that this really matters in this moment. And so the concentration level is so much higher, and it can't be replicated in a rehearsal. So I feel like my job as conductor is to position the orchestra in a way that they can feel very confident about the music, have ownership of it, and to be able to pivot if they want to. And it's interesting, and I'm sure you can apply this in a lot of other disciplines, but if you play something over and over in a very consistent way, you take the same tempo, you do the same dynamics here, you come down for this thing because you have to hear this other voice. All those things are rehearsed carefully the same way over and over. That actually allows you to improvise because you're so disciplined about it. If you kind of say, well, let's do it a little like this and a little like that so that you can be able to pivot, that actually is harmful, I think, because you don't actually have a point of reference from which to go. You've always been here or you've been there. Which way is it? Now it's very hard to actually adjust in a way that's very cohesive. So these are all psychological aspects of conducting. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about the different things that I have to do as a conductor in terms of just when I see the page. Let's go to the next slide, which would be we can go to the second movement. This is a very famous movement, the second movement from Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. You saw the first page of the first movement, and this is the famous part where they're just strings. At the beginning, it's just the violas, cellos, and the basses. And here I've marked in all the harmonic analysis of why this is such magical music. And I've written in my own phrasing. This is not phrasing that Beethoven has written. In fact, he is very sparse with that. He does write in crescendos and diminuendos, and he writes dynamics like piano and forte and mezzo forte, things like that. But if you look at something like this and you see really nothing there except one marking, piano, P, that means we have to play softly there. And he gives some indication about some of the articulations here. You can see that these are wedge-shaped, and this is a slur with two dots. So it's usually in the same bow, and you can see that, two up bows on these two connected notes. But other than that, does that mean that we just play the music in a very bland way? Just play the notes that are piano with the articulations? Or do we give it some sort of direction? This is my feeling about it. If you were learning a Shakespeare soliloquy, that soliloquy would be referring to things, most likely, that are foreshadowing something that's going to happen, referring back to something that already happened. There's a play on words in there somewhere about something. There's a little bit of humor. There's some tragedy. There's all of this inside of that soliloquy by Shakespeare. But you don't always see, well, let's put this in bold type so the reader is careful to really enunciate that. Or this is in italics, so that they'll really say this a different way. Or let's make this pause here. Yes, things are on different lines, perhaps. But you have to understand what Shakespeare's trying to say in order to say it correctly, or say it properly. Because it's not going to be spoon-fed to you, like this is how you say this word. I think looking at scores is the same way. You can be very literal and just say, we're going to play the notes and we're not going to add anything. But if you actually understand how the harmonies work together and where there's more tension in the sound and when there's more release or resolution in the sound, that affects how you play the music. And when you understand the music the best you can, it's like the person reading Shakespeare. They understand the story. They understand they're foreshadowing something. They understand they're referring to something. They understand there's a play on words. There's a pun here. Those are the kinds of things you have to look at here. If you repeat something, and it's the exact same thing you played exactly the same way. Is that how you would speak to somebody if they didn't quite understand or hear you very well? You say it exactly the same? You might say it a little louder, you might say it a little lighter. But you probably vary it. So I think of music as expression, it's communication. It has a lot of similarities to how we express language. So I come up with a way that I think is the most effective. And some people say, well, how can there be that much change in interpretation from one person to another if you're all playing the same notes? You're not changing the notes. That is true. You don't change the notes. But for all of the things I just told you, those are the differences. Every conductor could be saying, I am the most faithful to every note on the page. You have 100 different conductors, and you hear it 100 completely different ways when they're all trying to be absolutely faithful to the score. They're not trying to add anything to make it their own. They're just trying to make it as powerful as possible. And you do that by trying to take what you understand of the composer's intent, but along with your own experience and how you hear the music. Because that's most likely going to relate to other people in the audience as they hear it. So let's go to the next slide. Yes, also sprach Zarathustra. So this is music of Richard Strauss. Richard Strauss, he is not related, was not related to the Johann Strauss family, who is Austrian. Richard Strauss is a German composer. His father, Franz, actually played in Wagner's orchestras and didn't like Wagner's music. Richard's father didn't. And I only bring you that up because we had our principal horn, Alex Schuhan, just played the Richard Strauss horn concerto. And so I remember this story kind of being there in my mind. But this young Richard Strauss decided to mostly write music that was influenced by something else. So when we look at Beethoven's symphony that we just saw, we see that it is just a symphony, just a symphony. He may very well have been influenced by something, heard something, wanted to express something, but there's no program or extra musical information that goes along with composing that. That's what we would call absolute music. With Richard Strauss, in contrast, who came much later than Beethoven, also sprach Zarathustra, or Thus Spake Zarathustra, is based on his reading of Nietzsche's book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Now, is it supposed to depict philosophy in there? Not necessarily. This is what a composer composes after being inspired by reading something like that. And so, the reason I'm showing this to you is just to show you the evolution of the score, how it gets larger, and how there are more instruments, and how it gets much more complex, and how you can see that someone sitting first chair violin would not be able to lead this. Or someone sitting at a harpsichord, which there was no more harpsichord after about the middle of Haydn's symphony output. So we see some of these. This is a tempo marking, but it's in German here. That says always becoming broader in this etwas breiter werden. And so, oh yeah, I write a mistake here because I found something in the score. I think there might even be something up here. Can you scroll down for a second? Yeah. Okay, so here's just a little point. I noticed this today when I was taking a picture of this to send it in. You probably can't see it really clearly, but there are a number of instruments who are doubling on this note here. If you look through, you can see the bassoons here be a B natural. So I noticed this is what you have to do as a conductor. You have to go through every note the best you can to understand how it's put together. So you're kind of taking the score apart. Like a mechanic, if you want to understand an engine, you take it apart and then you try to put it back together, you have a more a full understanding. So this is bass clarinet. This is the bass clarinet line over here. All the instruments are on the side of the stave. You can see here. This says bass clarinet. It says B here. Now, in German nomenclature, that would be B flat, the note B flat. It's just how it is. So that means that everything would be at least a step lower. In this case, because it's a bass clarinet and it's in treble clef, it actually is a major ninth below what we see. And so this here would be a concert. When we say concert, we mean the actual pitch. The actual pitch, like on piano, would be a B flat. It's marked as a C, C natural. But because it's written in B flat is one whole step lower than C. So it would be a B flat. Now, meanwhile, you have bassoons. This is fagotte. This is the German writing for bassoons. You can see they're playing a B natural in bass clef here. So you know that this is a clash. This is a mistake in the music. But flash back to the full page now. You can't just go through this and say, oh yeah, it looks like they're playing the same line, so I'll just kind of be good with that. No, you have to notice these things. You have to go through every single note, and this is just on one page. This can take hours to go through one page, and you have 100 pages to go, or 200 pages in a Mahler symphony. That's what the conductor is spending time doing, is they're going through each note to say, oh, there's a mistake here, I have to make sure I know that. So that's just the literal aspect, is what notes are on the page. So the conductor must have the ability to read the score and learn how to read the score. Then there are the extra musical things that go with it. I talked a little bit about it with the Beethoven 7th Symphony, second movement. You just play the notes, like, because there's no indication to do a little bit of phrasing? I don't think so. No one wants to hear music like that is just bland and plodding along. But now we're talking about music that was inspired by another author. So does that mean I should read Thus Spake Zarathustra by Nietzsche so that I understand this music? Not necessarily. I did, to try to understand it, because you want to crawl into the composer's mind as much as possible. But I'm not sure there's anything you can tangibly add to the music if it's done by a great composer. If it's a great work of art already, it should not need, this is my opinion, it should not need the program to support it. Daniel Barenboim, who's a famous pianist and conductor, talked about this as well. He said, if you just discovered a piece of music somewhere, and it works from the first bar of the piece to the last bar, and it's a great piece of music, what other help would the program be if you knew what the piece was about? It has no text. There are no words. It just has notes and color, which is it expresses color, and it can take you through this kaleidoscope of emotions. So without the words, what does it really mean? It can mean everything to the listener, and you can say exactly what it means to you, but it doesn't have inherent meaning. And then we can't say this is about this. It can make you feel a certain way. If you say the music means this, all you're really describing is your reaction to the music, not really what the music is. The music is only itself. So I think, yes, it's good to try to get as much information about music as you can. What did the composer write about? What did the composer read in being influenced to write the piece? But I'm not sure that it would yield results that could be helpful. Maybe, maybe not. I would rather stick with what I see on the page and see what that does for me. And of course, I'm curious anyway, so yes, I want to read something that they've read to see what I can glean from it. But ultimately, this is all you have. Yes?
So I have a question. So I understand you're reading the music silently. Don't you at some point have to hear it?
Yeah.
On the piano?
Good. So I do a mixture of things when I study. When I study the music, I will take a piece like this and sit at the piano and go very, very slowly. Very slowly. Like, I will look at which lines are doubling each other, and I can do that just at sight. I can see who has it. And then I will go over to the piano and start to play through those things. And I'll see what motives sound like other motives. I'll see if the composer took a motive and turned it upside down, and so on, or who has the main melodic material, which parts are double. And I'll do that with each line. And that's where I can sometimes see something like that, where there's a mistake in the part. Sometimes I sit and just try to sing through the parts. That is also very slow. And as you start to get more of a picture in your mind, you can do more and more of that. And sitting at the piano helps because it helps put you in the position that an orchestra player is in when they're looking at their part. And the conductor can empathize with players who are sitting there who are reading the music and playing it through. For example, what's helpful for me is I'm playing through something on the piano and then I'll go, oh, my tendency would always want to be able to play that as an F sharp, but it's not. Because it just sounds like that's where the composer wanted to go, but it isn't. So I make a note about it, and sure enough, that tendency will happen for someone else, and it's just something that you catch in a different way, because you're putting yourself in the shoes of the people you're going to conduct. That's helpful. But it's also helpful just to get the oral picture. You know, to that end, some people have said that there are people who can look at a score and just hear it in their mind. That, on the surface, is preposterous. That is akin to you saying, I can look at a newspaper that's this big, and I can read every word on there at once. No, you can't. You physically cannot do it. It's not a possibility to do that, unless you're, I don't know, you can't do it. The only thing you could do that would be some sort of scanner or something like that. But you can't make sense out of something just by looking at it. It takes time to look at the score. You can't see the notes down here while you're looking up here. You just can't see them. So it takes time to go through, and yes, with a lot of work, you can start to, what they say, audiate, where you look at the notes and you have a memory of what that pitch is and what that sound of that instrument is, and then you put that to use. Because when we talk about perfect pitch, when we talk about any kind of musical pitch, we're really talking about the memory of a pitch. It isn't like when people say, he was born with perfect pitch. It's like, well, but that person had to learn what an A sounded like first. And that means that they had a good facility for memorizing the sound of what that is. And that's how you get the perfect pitch. So when you're audiating, you're looking at certain notes, and then you have a memory of what that pitch is. And so if I've done a piece before, of course, that comes much more rapidly back to me. And not so much listening to recordings. And that's one of the reasons I didn't want to have recordings here for you today. You can certainly, as a conductor, listen to recordings, but I learned as a young conductor that if you listen to the recording in order to learn the piece, you're going to be way off when you get on the podium. Because in the recording studio, they have knobs, and they turn down certain instruments, they turn up other instruments, and sometimes it's not an actual depiction of what is on the page in front of you. You hear voices that you would never hear when you're on the podium, and vice versa. So I remember being up there, I was doing Appalachian Spring, and I thought, oh, I haven't heard, that must be a wrong note there, it's dissonant. It's like, no, it was right. It's like, I only needed that to happen once as a student. I said, no more. From now on, I sit at the piano to learn, because you have to learn the score from the inside out. And you learn from recordings, you learn from the outside in. And it becomes this superficial way of kind of knowing a piece. Now, if you get more established and you know what you're doing, of course you can hear a recording and it won't influence you, because you've already been doing it for so many decades that it actually won't affect you negatively. You know that you still have to go deep into the score. Let's go to the next slide. See what I have now. Oh yeah. So we're getting increasingly more complex. We're now looking at the year 1913. This is music by Igor Stravinsky. And this is one page out of my score of The Rite of Spring, the Sacre du Printemps. And you can see here, there are a lot of different mixed meters in here. So usually you see a time signature of 4/4 or common time with a C, or C with a slash through it, cut time or à la brève, 2/2, things like that. But as you get increasingly into the late 19th century, you start to see what we call asymmetrical meters, or things that don't line up in a symmetrical way, like a 7/8 bar or a 5/8 bar or something like that, where you can't divide it into even compound groups. And this would be an example of that. So when you have 5/8, it usually has to be some combination of 2 beats plus 3 beats, or 3 beats plus 2 beats. And sometimes that is clear, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes conductors decide different ways to do a 5/8 bar, because they say, well, this is the strong beat, it should be here. And someone else says, yes, but the other people bounce off of that beat. It's easier if they come, if you do it the other way. So, and here, for something like 9/8, I have here, I say in 4. You think, well, 9/8 is usually 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? So it would be 3 sets of 3. That would be the normal way to conduct it. But when we're talking about complex music like this, you see that it's actually notated in a very duple form until the last beat. So you have this extra 8th note there. So it's really like 8/8 time with an extra little tail on the end. So really you conduct it almost like 4 with just a little extra 8th note. But these are things you have to notice, and this is my shorthand for that. Everyone comes up with their own way of shorthand. This is my shorthand. So this would be duple, 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 triplet at the end of the bar. And again, this is for study purposes. When you go through, you don't want to leave the score blank. You want to have actual notation so that every time you open it, you go, yes, I'm at this level of understanding this piece. And I've decided how that goes and how that works for me. And then you try to internalize those pulses the best that you can. Yes?
Is it a rest at the end of the bar?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's an 8th note rest at the end, and there's an 8th note rest at the beginning. And so you have this cha, cha, boom, boom. So you have it's really only the last beat of the bar that adds the extra 8th rest at the end. So this is just an example. These are grace notes and so on, but I also just wanted to show you the size of the score for every bar. You see, again, this is one bar that goes all the way down. This is another bar, and both of these I decided to go 2 plus 3. And then in this, 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 3, in order to beat that bar in a way that the orchestra can understand. Yes?
So I'm assuming that all those different musicians also have their ideas of where the crescendo should be and where this should be.
Yes.
So do you get pushback, or do you just tell them this is how it's going to be?
Yeah, so musicians only have their line. They're only their line. So I am the only one. The conductor is the only person who has a score of everyone's part. All of the musicians, the rest of the musicians just have the piccolo player, this is flute piccolo, has only their line, and so on. And so, yes, to your question, they have a different idea of what fortissimo means, or what forte means. Fortissimo would be very loud, forte, loud, mezzo forte, medium loud, piano, soft. Okay, so everyone has a different idea of what that means. And it's up to the conductor to say that's too loud. Even though you're playing fortissimo, your fortissimo is louder than what that person can produce. And we have to hear that voice too. So you have to play what you think is forte in order to hear the other sound over here that has to be heard. So that's a big part of what the conductor does in rehearsal.
And if you have 8 violinists, you have to hear what each of those 8 are doing, so they're all going to be singing different.
So there are those instrumental groups that all play the same line, like the violins. First violins, you might have 10 or 12 or 8, depending on the piece, all playing the same exact line. And they need to be able to hear each other. but they all have the same line, so they should have the same articulation, they should be matching and blending their pitch and their sound, as opposed to a woodwind player or a brass player, all of whom are playing solo lines. Even if you're third trumpet, you're the only one with that timbre and that color who's playing that third trumpet line, even if it doubles with someone else. But the other group instruments, yes, they play together. And it's best if they can try to hear other people while they're playing. It's a difficulty of being an orchestral musician, but it is, the very best ensembles in the world play with that in mind. I wanted to talk a little bit about the different aspects of conducting, but before I do that, I want to go to the next thing, which I believe is the transposition. Oh, Restless Oceans. Yeah, let's do that. Just quickly, because it has aspects. This is one page out of Restless Oceans. So for any of you who came to our first classics, this is one page out of that. And you can see I try to find things that have different colors on them, because they mean different things. The way this score is a little bit different than some of the others is that you see that there are extra notations in here for stomping your feet. So they have maybe two staves in their part where they have the stomping and then they have to actually play. And so you can see some of this. In this particular case, the flutes are doing a flutter tonguing. That's what those lines are on the stave. And you can see that they play loud through here, but then they have to start quietly here. Foot stomping is starting here. We can scroll down a little bit. I marked the time signatures in green, or anything that has to do with time or rhythm is in green pencil. This helps me to really keep things organized when I have just a sea of notes and indications in front of me. It helps me sort it out. And then I marked certain things like where they have to yell. Ho! They had to yell that during the piece. And when you have that much of the music kind of staring up at you from your music stand, it helps to have some of these indications just marked or highlighted so that you know exactly where that's happening. And then you can see the meter changes and so on. Let's go to the next slide. I just wanted to show this to you because we just did this piece on the master course, our first classes. So here's another thing. I talked briefly about the B-flat bass clarinet. But this is important that you know that conductors have to do this on a regular basis.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, there it is. It's sliding over to the side. Yeah, it's just, okay. So, all right, here's just a general smattering, for example, of what we see in the score on a regular basis. This shows the written note that a musician would see. This is for the alto flute in G.
Sorry.
It's okay. So the musician sees this note, which is a C in treble clef. If you're F, A, C, E, I don't know, you can read music, so you memorize these spaces. But this is the actual note that comes out when they read this note and play a C. The actual concert pitch, or the actual pitch, is a G. It's a fourth, perfect fourth below. And that's what's going to happen with every note they see and play. It's always going to be a perfect fourth below. It's going to sound a perfect fourth below. The English horn is a woodwind instrument. It's not like the French horn, which is a brass instrument, but the English horn is like a large oboe. It sits in the oboe section. Plays on a double reed and a little vocal. And when the English horn player sees a C, an F comes out because it's pitched in F. Everything is in relationship to C, to the note C. Clarinet and B flat. B flat is a whole step lower than C, so their note would sound a B flat, even though they're reading the note C. The easiest way to explain why this is because imagine you get a tube of something, and it's a certain size, and you blow into it, and its fundamental is the pitch C. And then you make holes in it, and you play something that we would call diatonic, or it doesn't have any sharps or flats in it. And you just play that diatonic scale. Everything works in C. Now, if you have a larger tube, That's gonna be a lower pitch. Might be in B flat now because it's lower, or in A, or in F. And if you did the same scale that matched the C tube, it would be in completely different key. It would be sounding in a different key. And so that's why we have all these different instruments in different keys. But the conductor needs to be able to look at a big score like the Strauss tone poem that we saw, or the Stravinsky Rite of Spring, and be able to say, okay, that's the written note, but what is the actual pitch of the instrument? So that's another thing that just takes a long time to sort through. And that's just one extra thing we have to do. But I see that I've used a lot of time here, and I know that some of you have already asked questions. I could go on and on and on, but I feel like I've covered some of the things that we have to do before we show up for the first rehearsal, and that is, you have to feel as though you could just conduct the performance at the first rehearsal. You have to be that ready to go. And if you've not conducted the piece before, you have to feel as though you've conducted it 50 times. You just have to be that prepared with a professional orchestra. Because you have to work very quickly. You've got very limited time to get everything together. And as you pointed out, a lot of different people have different ways that they think the music should go. So you're really thinking in terms of, what does a conductor do? I wrote down just a few things. I have been thinking about this for years. Conductor is a listener, first and foremost. You have to really listen to the orchestra. You're a coach. If you don't hear something that's right, it isn't necessarily because there's an error in the parts. It's because the phrasing has to be more unified. So you want everyone to feel the phrase going in the same direction. But sometimes you are a referee or an umpire, where you have to say, no, that you're a little bit late there. You're a little early, it's a little sharp, a little flat, it should be a B flat, those kind of things. You're also a manager. Sometimes you're actually not very heated in terms of the actual time beating. You're not. If you're doing a little Mozart symphony where you can hear the motor rhythm that's playing the violas and the second violin, sometimes the cellos, everyone can sense that. They can hear that. They don't need you to just beat time when you're aware that they can hear it. So that isn't so important. What's more important is that you're doing that reminding of what you did in rehearsal. And I alluded to this earlier, but you're also a psychologist. You're a group psychologist. You're working with all of these professional musicians who have their own ideas and are complex human beings that are to be respected and celebrated, and they're all bringing their very best to rehearsal. And so they're not just these people that you just tell them what to do, like buttons on an organ or something like that, but they are people you need their goodwill for them to execute this piece of music in the most powerful way possible as a group. And you need to be a communicator. There are some people who can hear very well, and they could be good conductors, but they're not very good at the nonverbal communication. And this is really what we have to do. We have to be good verbal communicators, but we have to be even better nonverbal communicators, because that's really where things happen. That's really where things happen. You can show certain things, and sometimes you can't show everything, so you have to explain it. But for the most part, you have to be showing and communicating your idea, your vision for the music. And if you're good enough at it, and the musicians are looking occasionally at you, then it will work. And I know some of you are thinking, I don't see the players looking at the conductor ever. But you have to also realize that these players who play in the orchestra are experts at seeing peripherally. They could be looking almost this far away. I'm over here, and if they see something change, they notice it right away. So yes, they're not looking at the conductor like this, but they can see the conductor, even if they're looking at their music. So that is something good. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
Are there courses given in music school on conducting, or is it too much of an individual thing?
Choruses, did you?
Horses.
Courses, yes. Okay, so almost every undergraduate music major needs to take some sort of basic conducting class. And especially for music education people, they must take conducting classes. So they learn some rudimentary things about transposition, but it's mostly just learning how to actually conduct. And then I got my master's degree in conducting, but there were practically no courses on how to physically conduct. It was all about study. It was all about score study and style and musicology and manuscripts and orchestration and things like that. It was hardly anything on actual the physical part of conducting in graduate school. You're supposed to be beyond knowing the patterns and things like that by that time. But yes, in undergrad, it does happen.
The individual players with their sheet, with only their music, do they have it noted up like yours is?
They do not. So did everyone hear the question? Yeah. Okay, so they do not have it. These are things that I write in when I study and things that I want to share with them. I'll mark things like shorthand, like I don't want to hear too much of this long note. Let's say long notes in the horns or in the low brass, because they're going to cover this other part. So I'll do a little scribbly mark through it, and that's shorthand to me that shouldn't be too loud. This has to be down.
But they don't put it on their sheet.
They don't. They usually have a pencil with them, so if I say, we're going to lift after this note, we're always going to put a little lift, and then we play. We don't play it straight into it. They'll take out their pencil and mark a little comma there in their part. There are conductors sometimes who mark their own parts. The first thing I showed you today was Rachel Barton-Pine, and she was the violinist who played. She wasn't the conductor. Although she does do that piece without a conductor where she just leads. But she marked all the parts, and some conductors will mark the parts in a certain way. They won't do it like I did, but they'll mark the bowings and things like that. But they don't have the markings that I have.
Well, but their own mark.
They have their own.
That's what I mean. They have their own mark.
They can pencil in their own markings, at rehearsal. Or if they're studying the music at home, they can say, "Oh, I always play an F sharp there, and I want to play an F natural." So they'll make a reminder mark to themselves. Anyone?
How many instruments do you play? Is that important? And if you don't play one, have you learned the qualities that you're looking for?
Right.
And the other question is, what's the rule about clapping between
Okay. I'll try to go through those briefly. Instruments that I play. I played low brass through high school. Mostly tuba and trombone. And then late in high school and early in college, I started to play oboe. And that's what I got into graduate school on, was oboe. And that was my orchestral instrument. I wish that I had been better at piano, because the oboe is very difficult to continue on unless you love making reeds for 2 or 3 hours every day, which I don't, and I didn't enjoy, and it's very difficult to keep up on. So I switched my allegiance to the piano, but only as a tool, not as a performance instrument. If you heard me play piano, you'd be like, "Oh my gosh, he plays piano?" But that's what I use to realize the scores that I have. It's very slow and painstaking. So, do I think it's important? I think you have to have a very good working knowledge of what the instruments can do. You have to know the orchestration. You have to know what things you can ask an instrument to do.
How do you get that knowledge in school?
Yeah, in school you can take pedagogy classes, and so you understand how instruments make their sound. By being good at your own instrument, it actually helps a lot for that group, for that instrumental family. Strings for me was something I hadn't really played, and so what I did was I hung around and watched lots of rehearsals. I would watch string quartet rehearsals where they talk about everything about bowing, about not only which way it is, but how you get a certain sound at a different part of the bow. I will not be shy at all in asking concertmasters, how do you get the sound? How do you get this? And then I watch and observe, and I try things, and pretty soon you start getting a pretty good knowledge of what's going to work. Okay, so going to clapping between movements. This can be a thorny issue. I wish it were not. We have to know that the no clapping rule between movements is a 20th century invention. That convention of not clapping is a 20th century invention. It did not happen during Mozart's day. In fact, if you look through some of the letters that Mozart sent to his father, there's one in particular. He wrote his Paris Symphony, and he wrote some very fancy passages for the violins to play. He wrote to his father and said, "Father, they applauded during the music. Parisians! Who knows more about culture than them?" And Mozart, he's pretty much up there, pretty high. He thought it was okay. Parisians thought it was okay. They clapped over the music like it was jazz during. So the other thing is that programs were put together, they weren't always like, here's Mozart's 40th, all 4 movements on the second half. There would be programs like you'd hear a movement from a Schumann Romance, just for, clarinet and piano, and then you would hear something, you'd hear one movement, the first movement of Mozart's 40th, and then you would hear some little march by some other composer, and then maybe on the second half you'd hear the second movement from that symphony that you heard the first movement to earlier, and then you'd hear something else, and so there's clapping going on all the time. This idea that you do not clap between movements is an idea like as though it's a full work, like chapters of a book. And we don't clap until the book is finished, until the symphony is done, and there are different chapters, so don't interrupt it. But I think let's just be intuitive about the music. If it ends really big, like the end of the first movement of a Tchaikovsky symphony, or the end of Tchaikovsky violin concerto first movement, how can you not applaud that? Right? It just feels like you should. It has that celebratory feeling. Everyone's playing big and loud, and it sounds exciting. It's not the last movement, though, but people can't help themselves. They want to clap. I think places like that feel natural. And the musicians actually appreciate it, because they know that they're getting positive feedback from the audience. I think it's some people, they don't like it because it's convention, because it's the rules. Now, having said that, I will say, I think if we're being intuitive, not everyone's the same, of course, but if you hear something that's very ethereal, meditative, maybe melancholy, and it just kind of wafts off into the ether somewhere, you don't feel like going, hey! No, you don't. You feel kind of like, let's let that just set for a second. And there's something magical about that moment. To me, that's the intuitive feeling. Some people, they might think, no, I want to applaud it. But if you fault them for that, we're trying to win people over to come to symphonic music. I've been in audiences where I've seen the conductor turn around and glare at the person or in the direction of where they heard applause in between the movements. And I thought, that person's not coming back. Who wants to be shamed at a concert? Nobody. People want to feel welcome, and when they feel like there are all these secret rules you have to have, then it's not very welcoming. And I like to break those barriers down. I think music is for everybody. I think if there's an intuitive feeling about how the music sounds and makes them feel at the end of the movement that's not the last one, let them clap. The orchestra really doesn't have, I can't speak for everybody, obviously, but it's usually a positive thing, and it kind of can break the ice. I think it's fine. That's my feeling about it. That's my response. But there are some people who feel different. Yes, sir.
Can I diss Parisians for a minute?
Hey.
I want to diss Parisians for a minute.
Oh, yeah.
So during the construction of Notre Dame Cathedral, which took like 100 years to build, and one of the reasons it took close to 100 years to build, occasionally during the construction, the Parisians sacked the church. They're not the epitome of culture from my perspective.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was just being facetious a little bit about it. I'm sure they know plenty about culture. It was just more of a joke than anything. To say, of all people, I mean, they were proving it, but yeah, that's all. Any other questions about, yes, sir?
After the preparation, how much do you retain at the concert without looking at the score? The reason I ask
yeah,
is we used to live in the Boston area, we used to go see Station Island, South Pacific, He has a big pile of music on his head, he never opens.
So there are conductors who conduct, some people say it's from memory. I say it's without the score. Because I think there's a difference. I think if you say you're conducting something from memory, you should be able to sit down and write out every single note of also Sprach Zarathustra or Beethoven 7, every note and every articulation and every dynamic. And that's really knowing it from memory. Otherwise, I think you're just conducting without the score, which is fine. I have nothing against that. I think it can be a bit of a showboat kind of thing to do, but sometimes conductors feel sincerely that they connect better with the musicians if they don't have the score in front of them. That's fine. That's a very subjective thing. I look at my job as, I'm not really a performer of it. I mean, yes, I'm performing with musicians, but I really see this, my job is to be responsible. Be responsible for them. They're the ones making the sound. They're the ones that need someone up there who's got the charts. If something happens, someone gets lost, someone comes in a bar early, and that was the cue for someone else to come in, now what's going to happen? If you have the score there, you can kind of get people back on, because you can actually say, you can, and I've done this in a concert before, where I've had to whisper out in a very harsh whisper that hopefully the audience couldn't hear, where we were. Letter H! 2 before L! You know, but how are you going to do that with no score? And it's also that you could, you know, show everyone that you could conduct without a score. Again, if that's Seiji Ozawa, who you mentioned, who's unusual that way. Supposedly he had a photographic memory, so he probably would be able to say exactly what they were. You're at bar 188, you know, he just would know in his mind because he can actually see the score in his head. But if someone has photographic memory, it doesn't mean that they've integrated that music into their system in a way that, it doesn't mean that. They could have, but it doesn't mean that. I will say that after study, and then especially standing in front of the orchestra, through the rehearsals, it is much easier not to really need the score too much to consult, especially if it's a staple of the repertoire that I've done many times. But even if I could conduct something without the score, I think I would want to have the score there anyway. I would just always want to have it there. I just think it's my job. My job is to be responsible to the musicians. That's my first job. So, anyway, anyone else? Yes? So we usually at the Binghamton Philharmonic can do our shows on about 3 rehearsals and sometimes a 4th, which has maybe a sectional in it where we work on specific things. Other orchestras may take 4 rehearsals, and that usually has to do with the amount of music that's on a program, or the complexity, or how well the work is known already before you get together. So that's dependent on those things, but usually it's between 3 and 4 rehearsals, and usually the rehearsals are 2.5 hours long. Yeah. So it's actually not very much time to put together everything, and you'd be surprised, but coming to a first rehearsal at the Binghamton Philharmonic or any number of professional orchestras, you would hear on the very first reading of a piece that, hey, that sounds pretty good. You know, if you come to the first reading of our Beethoven 6th symphony that we did, just the reading already was quite good. And so then it was a matter of coordinating and get everyone on the same page, as it were. So, yeah.
How about soloists, so that they don't even?
Right. So soloists, oftentimes it's convention for them to play without the music in front of them. They just memorized it. So Alex Schillen, who played the horn, he didn't have any music in front of him. He played that piece through probably hundreds of times before he got in front of the orchestra. And that is a convention for the most part, but there are a lot of musicians who are now just unabashedly opening themselves at the piano and play, especially if it's a contemporary work. It's very complex, and you don't want to just take a risk of not being able to remember some silly little thing, like one little bar change or something. And so why is that worth putting it on the line to get lost? So they'll use their music. I don't have a problem with soloists if they want to use their music. They say, that's fine. You can play the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto and use the music if you want. I care more about how music sounds. And if someone feels comfortable because the music is there, say, that's fine with me. So, but most soloists do not play with the music.
So, we have this big emphasis on the score. And to me, that's visual. And music is oral.
Mhm.
And does the instrumentalist or conductor have the score memorized, or do they have the sound memorized?
I think they have the sound memorized. You have to really look at a score as kind of like a blueprint or a schematic, something that it's telling you information, but you have to translate that into sound, and sound is really the most meaningful thing. I've had people come up to me and say, you know what, I can't read a note of music, but I can play pretty well, and they can. And I think, well, actually, that is what really matters, is that you have this connection to the sound, because that's what music actually is. We use this because it's practical. And it's practical to be able to read music so that you can play it and just show up at a gig, and then here's the music, I can play it. If you showed up somewhere and they said, well, I have to teach this to you so you can learn it, that's not practical in any way. So we use music because it's a practical way. And obviously for posterity, this is how Beethoven, there's no recording device back then, so he couldn't have passed that on unless it was through the oral tradition. I don't know how you do that with a symphony. So, yeah, that's what we have.
So I was surprised to see how little is on each page, and
Yeah.
then you're reading down.
Mhm.
So I'm curious what your music looks like when you go in to play, because it seems like you'd be always turning the page.
So this is the Rite of Spring. It has 153 pages in it to get everyone's part in there. An instrumentalist might have 6 pages, which is their lineup. Sometimes it's more, sometimes less, sometimes it's going to be 3 or 4, depending which instrument you're playing. But yeah, this is kind of the size of the score that I use.
So do you turn pages a lot?
Yes.
I don't ever, I've said that you turn the pages.
Well, that's nice. I do turn them a lot. Well, here's the thing. When I know the score very well, you know how it is when you're reading something, you remember where it is on the page. And it's like, oh, I want to find that passage. I know where it is. I can know when I need to turn the page even though I'm not looking at the music. So, and I'll know that I need to turn 3 pages there because I haven't looked at it for a while. And so I'll just page through without even looking. I'll know where I am in the music because I'm just so used to it. It's just through doing it over and over and over again. It's the frequency that helps you with something like this.
Do you ever have anything really interesting happen during the concert, weird, like something that occurred while during the concert? Because I remember something when John Cavelli was conducting that some individual stood up and said, "This is Paul," and walked out of the forum. I was sitting in the forum, we all heard it. It was very weird, because there was something wrong with this person, But have you ever had any?
Did Maestro Cavelli stop when that happened? No.
No, and he kept going.
I haven't heard, there are funny little things. I mean, I've thrown a baton before. I didn't mean to, but it just kind of flew out of my hand. We've had unexpected cymbal crashes.
Yeah.
One fairly recently in a very quiet moment. But not too much, really. Not too much like that. Yeah, but occasionally. Yeah. I think that we've used a lot of time here. Thank you very much for coming today, for your questions. I appreciate your attendance here, and I hope you can come to more of our Masterwork. How many of you come to our Masterworks programs down at the Forum? You should. You should come down to more, or any of our POPs offerings right down at the Forum. Orchestra is really, really wonderful. And we play a wide variety of music there, so on a very expert level. So come in and hear us.
Thank you.